explore what it looks like to Topo Chico be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler, Andrew, and Ben are here, and Cody. Cody's on the other side of the camera today, and we are doing this via Zoom today because Portland, in the Portland metro area, had the second largest day of snow in recorded history yesterday.
Whoa.
Yes. So there was a day in 1943 that had a couple inches more, but the 10.8 inches that were recorded at the airport last night, the biggest that we've had. And so Cody made his way to the office, but the rest of us are stuck at home. And so we decided we would just record this way today. How's it looking up in the hills, Mr. Murch?
Yeah, we got probably 12 to 15 inches up here. Our neighborhood is impassable. It will, I doubt we'll be able to even get out with four-wheel drive or anything before Saturday, probably. Yeah, it's nuts. Recording this Thursday.
Ben, have you been out at all?
No, just out in the backyard. Yeah, there's definitely 8 to 10 inches probably, and yeah, we're not going anywhere. We don't have the cars to handle that for sure.
Yeah. Cody, what about you?
Yeah, the roads weren't horrible, but me and Jordan tried to make it over to Pacific House, and we didn't want to walk because it's too windy. And in the truck, like because of the wind has blown like these massive piles, I almost got stuck in the parking lot in 4x4 in the 1500. And I was like, oh, sweet, this is going to be great when Gabby has to pick me up from the church parking lot.
Yeah, I was flying home from Virginia yesterday, and when I got on the flight, the pilot said there's snow in the Portland area, but he said, but at the airport specifically, there's only about an inch, and it shouldn't be that bad. We're not worried about it. And so then in the 5.5 hours that it took to fly from Charlotte to Portland, that 1 inches and we're not worried about it literally jumped to 10. And yeah, I was like getting my car out of the parking lot at the airport. I was like, oh, I'm going to get stuck before I even get out of the parking lot. It's like over 10 inches of snow. No one had driven on it, like on the aisles that I had to get out of the parking lot. But yeah, so we're all home today, but we thought we would do an episode of TBTC this way. And yeah, so we have some questions from some listeners. Let's get started here. Let's see, let's find one. All right, here's one. The Old Testament describes a bunch of different types of sacrifices: animal, drink, grain, incense, tithing, and a bunch of others. Jesus fulfilled the Levitical law, and I don't recall the New Testament specifically calling for a tithe. In parentheses, feel free to correct me. I have observed NGC encouraging sacrifice in the form of service, one's time, and tithes and offerings, one's finances. Are these the primary forms of sacrifice at NGC? And I'll even broaden it from the question asker. Are these the primary forms of sacrifice in the New Testament? Why does NGC promote these two forms of Old Testament sacrifice, but not the others described? And then they have a little note here. Please note, this is not a request to splash animal blood around the auditorium. That would be weird.
Well, interesting. I don't think that NGC prescribes any form of Old Testament sacrifices. So I understand the question asker correlating the idea of sacrifice, which we certainly talk about. Romans 12, 1 and 2 comes to mind. Offering our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. This is your spiritual worship. So I definitely think we preach the idea of all of life as worship, and that that there certainly is ways that we're called to sacrifice in all of our life, prescribed in the New Testament. So, but the correlation of like, these are Old Testament sacrificial ways that we're somehow prescribing, that doesn't track. The book of Hebrews would teach that Christ was the perfect sacrifice given once for all, and that we don't pick up these institutions of Old Testament sacrifice and somehow observe them as Christians. So, and that's where I think I would start with this question, is like the correlation. It's a very truncated view of the gospel and the new covenant to say the Old Testament had all these rules you had to follow, all these sacrifices you had to give, all this stuff you had to do, commandments you had to obey. And the New Testament just basically teaches what? Like, love God. What does that look like? Right. Or the gospel, free gift of grace. The New Testament does teach those things, but there's obedience to God that is talked about in the New Testament consistently. I mean, I was just reading John 15 today. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commands. And so there's Jesus certainly fulfills the law, and it's not through observance of the law that Christians are made righteous. It's through faith in the finished work of Christ. But the idea that like I'm a Christian, so there's no duty, D-U-T-Y. There's no response to God in living holy, in giving of time, talents, and treasures, et cetera. And I'm not saying the question asker is necessarily asking that. I'm just trying to address what seems to be a little bit of a false dichotomy in the question. And so I have some other thoughts, but let me stop there. Let Ben jump in. You want to add to that maybe in the first part of this?
Yeah, I think another aspect of it, we do in our church and most churches, when they talk about financial giving, use the phrase or the terminology tithes and offerings. And so another part of this question would be, the tithe is something that is a part of the Mosaic covenant, the Levitical law. Are new covenant believers, Christians, the church, are we obligated to tithe in the same sense that Israel was, giving 10% of our income or our resources? What do you think about that, Andrew? Are Christians obligated to tithe 10%, or is that just an Old Testament principle that is helpful, a helpful starting point, but then there's a different expectation in the new covenant when you look maybe 2 Corinthians 8 and 9?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in 1 Corinthians 16 is another place that, on the first day of the week, lay aside what you've determined in your heart to give, and that's not saying a percentage either, but there's when it comes to tithe, like, does the New Testament command us to tithe in the same way as the Old Testament? The answer to that is no, in the way Israel would tithe. But giving of our money and stewarding our resources in that way, as the Bible prescribes, is a tangible thing by nature. Like, money is a tangible thing that there's percentages, there's actual content to that, to what giving would look like. The biblical starting point, this is language you get from Randy Alcorn's book, The Treasure Principle. The biblical starting point for giving is 10%. The tithe, right? That's the biblical starting point for giving that we see in the Old Testament. It's a principle. It predates the law. Abraham and Melchizedek, what is it, Genesis 11 or something? Or no, excuse me, that would be maybe Genesis 13, I think it is. Abraham didn't come around until Genesis 12, so I knew it wasn't Genesis 11. But the biblical starting point there, Abraham and Melchizedek, he gives him a tenth, right? Jacob gives a tenth to God. So, like, this is the starting point that predates the law. And so that's where we go back to that and go, okay, that looks to be a starting point. People bring up and Alcorn brings this up in his book as well, the fact that Jesus never lowers the bar. He always ups the ante as it relates to, you've heard it said. He mentions the law, and then he says, but I say to you, and he kind of ups the ante. And so again, is the 10% given in the New Testament is like, you must do this, right? No, not in the Old Testament type of way. And yet I want to hear the argument from the person, because I've had these conversations for decades with people in the local church, and there's always the dude, right? And I'm not saying this question asker is that dude, but there's always the dude that like knows so much that he knows, man. It's like, we're not supposed to die, man. Like, new covenant, man, new covenant, And you get down to it, and it's like, you just don't want to give, or you just want to give like $50 a month and call it like you're living out Romans 12, 1 and 2. And I look at that and I'm like, bro, just be real about this. Your finances are a mess. or you're greedy, or you've got, this is super ticked off Andrew on snow day.
Yes.
Or you want to give yourself an excuse to put more in your 401k than to give to the work of the local church. And I just go, dude, find that in the New Testament. Find in the New Testament where it's like the work of the gospel needs to be deprioritized so that I don't have to give to the church or through the church or as the church, and that I could just do kind of my own thing because tithing's not given in the New Testament. So, it's just like, bro, come on, what are we talking about here? So I don't know. That's my tithing rant. And because there's some people that are going to hear this that are from NGC and they're going to be like, Andrew, are you saying we shouldn't tithe? No, I'm saying you should tithe. You, in the sense of like, you're going to have a tangible starting point of where you give. And all I get from the scriptures is the tithe is the beginning. The tithe is not the end. The tithe is the beginning of that. So biblical starting point, you should start there. And my recommendation to you would be, you shouldn't end there because there are offerings beyond that you should do. And so, anyway, go ahead, Ben.
And I agree with all of that, because I think, although I don't think in the new covenant we're commanded to do the 10%, I've never met someone who brings that up who it's because they want to give more than 10%, right? It's because they want to give less, which reveals a heart issue. And so I do think the principle of 10% is a good starting point, and then move beyond there to Paul in 2 Corinthians with generous, sacrificial, cheerful, willful, all those principles, regular, to do that too. So even if we're not bound under the new covenant to 10%, I do agree that would be a good starting point. And then I think, just speaking of sacrifices, those things are fulfilled in Christ. And now, as you said, the sacrifice is our life. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Hebrews 13, 15 says, through him, this is through Christ, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. And so there's a sense in which our worship, our praise, our thanksgiving, our sacrifices that go up to God. And we do that through Christ, who was the once for all sacrifice that makes it possible for us to approach God with our praise. So I would say that's another element of our sacrificial worship as the church, is when we get together and praise through musical worship and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's good. Real quick, just to reiterate what Ben was saying, the three things we always teach on giving from the New Testament: regular, 1 Corinthians 16, sacrificial, you mentioned 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and cheerful. Regular, sacrificial, and cheerful. Those are the three things the New Testament in the epistles prescribe. So you got to look at your budget. I got to look at my budget, and we got to go regular. So I'm going to give as often as I get. Every time I get paid, I'm going to give. I get a gift, I'm going to give. Whatever, money comes in, money goes out. The first thing that goes out is giving. Regular, sacrificial, and cheerful. So the sacrificial part is the percentage time, right? And truly, if you're managing your budget, you're doing these kinds of things, what does sacrificial look like? I mean, for my household, sacrificial has looked like way more than 10% for years, right? Sacrificial is at least 15 to 20% in our household, and has been since my wife and I got married. Like, that's what it's going to be. We're going to tighten the belt on other areas. That's going to be the first thing we do. And we're going to try to grow that percentage every year, grow those dollar amounts, diversify. We're going to tithe to our local church. That's our, the way we exercise that. And then we're going to give offerings to missions and lots of other things. But 10% is going to be the starting point rather than an end point. Right. So Tyler, sorry, I kind of interrupted you there.
No, you're good. I come back to Matthew 5. And Jesus is like upping the ante in all these different ways. And I think the principle, is there as well, where, he talks about, like, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you this, you've heard it said, don't murder. But I say, even if you have anger in your heart, definitely not a moving backwards from the New Testament. The fact that, and again, we're not doing that like in the Old Testament, they were doing it to be made right with God. That's not why we do it as Christians. We're doing it as a response to the fact that we already are made right with God. And so, yeah, just good to add to the conversation. We were going to go to a different direction with the second question. We had another listener question, but let's hold off on that one because we posted a video not too long ago inviting people into church membership. And we posted this on social media. Cody filmed it, and I think it was me on the video talking and just saying church membership is the way that we live out being together as NGC. And we are promoting our membership class and saying, hey, come to NGC 101. And I don't remember the way it was worded exactly, but there was one comment on there on Facebook or Instagram somewhere that said, help me out, Cody. What did it say?
It's something along the lines of like, show me the verse that tells us that church membership is prescribed, or something along the lines of that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you answered the way you said you were going to, but
yeah, I did. I answered, come to the membership class and we'll show you. Or something like that. But yeah, I figured, let's tackle that question. Because I've heard that before. Show me the verse where church membership is prescribed in the New Testament.
Yeah, to just be vulnerable and honest, I'm just kind of burnt out from explaining this over and over and over again. So I mean,
Here, let's get it on the record right now, and then you just say go listen to that. You don't have to say it ever again.
And after the 10 minutes on tithing, then they're going to get this.
Yeah. Yeah. Where to begin? I do think church membership is biblical. There's not going to be a chapter and verse that says thou shalt become a church member and sign a covenant form or something like that. But it's explicit and implicit all throughout the New Testament that every single Christian who's a part of the Big C Universal Church is connected to a little c local church and is obeying the commands and expectations of the New Testament, primarily with those other believers that they're gathering with on an ongoing and consistent basis. There's all sorts of verses in Scripture that without church membership, which we would mean as not just a name on a list, but a commitment to a local body, to the leaders there, the other members there. There are verses in the New Testament that don't really make sense unless you have some sort of formal church membership. One that we go to often is Hebrews 13:17 that says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they will give an account, as those watching over your souls. And, when the New Testament says something like obey your leaders, every Christian has to ask, well, who is that for me? Is that every pastor everywhere? Is that every Christian leader on the planet? Obviously not. I think it's talking to a local church who has leaders who those specific Christians are called to obey and submit to. And then also from the leadership side, those who will give an account before God for keeping watch over your souls. How do pastors and elders answer that, question of who are those for me, if we don't know really who's committed to our local church? And a part of we live in a culture that's transient. People move around all the time. There's churches on every corner. There's cultural Christianity, Christmas and Easter kind of Christianity. And so it's hard to decipher who's actually a part of this local body, committed here, asking to be pastored, asking to be church disciplined, asking to be cared for and shepherded. And formal church membership gives clarity to that and helps us know who's in and who's not in. Now, if all that sounds super exclusive and kind of like not accepting, the only requirement to be a member of a local church is to be a believer who wants to commit to that local church. So anyone's welcome as long as they're a Christian and they're committing to this local body. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, but those are some of the things off the top of my head of why it's needed and why it's important. And at the end of the day, it's not so that we can control people. I know a lot of churches and leaders have done church membership poorly. But I know our heart at NGC, it's not to control, it's not to really focus on that, obey us and submit to us. Honestly, it's mostly the main reason is that we can shepherd people well and people don't fall through the cracks. It gets people on a list where they're known, they're prayed, they're cared for, especially a church the size of East Vancouver that's so large. Membership allows the elders to know who their people are and who they're responsible to care for. So ultimately, it's about caring well for people. It's not about anything else besides that.
Yeah, dude, Hebrews 13:17, like you read, that's like as good of a one verse proof text on this as we could probably find in terms of being able to recognize who are your leaders and leaders being able to recognize who are those souls you're giving an account for. And so, yeah, that would be one verse that I would mention. There are many others, but I like to, my answer on this question is always the same, and it's putting the burden of proof back on the question asker, right? So rather than, so someone says, you know, what verse in the New Testament prescribes church membership? My response is, what verse in the New Testament prescribes loosely connected, self-directed, commitment suspicious, self-determined, autonomous, unsubmitted, individualistic, consumeristic Christianity? Like where's the verse that says that? Like, find me a verse that shows that I'm not supposed to be a church member. And I think the burden of proof, as you look at New Testament Christianity, what they lived out in the New Testament versus what we see in American Christianity today, like, find me the verse that shows that church membership is going to get us less close to what we see worked out in the New Testament, the one another commands, Hebrews 13:17. Like, show me how church membership takes American Christianity further away from biblical Christianity than closer to it. Just show me that and you win the argument. But you're not going to find that. Like, there's not a verse. Again, it's back to this sort of reductionistic, like, I have something I don't want to do or that I don't want to submit to, and so show me the verse that, you know, that prescribes what you're saying. And I just think it's everywhere. Like, what we're talking, like what we talk about when we talk about church membership is just like literally being a Christian.
Oh, did we lose Andrew?
Disciples in
Oh,
accountable in covenant together. Like, that's just basic biblical Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys.
What's that?
Sorry, we lost you for a minute. I don't know about you guys, but hearing Zoom kind of do its delay thing is like giving me a little bit of anxiety from a couple of years ago, you know, when our whole lives are on Zoom. But we caught the gist of what you're saying. We just lost a few words there.
Can I ask a question, you guys? So, like, a lot, like, I feel like when I encounter people who are maybe anti-church membership, it's not that they're anti, it's almost like their stature or their posture is like, I attend and I tithe. Like, can you guys say why that's not enough for us here at NGC in regards to like actual membership? Why they go through a class, why they sign a piece of paper? Because I feel like more often than not, when I hear people like, oh, I'm a member, I'm like, really? And they're like, actually, I just attend and I tithe. Like, that's what they think membership is. Like, why is that not enough? Or why do we make them go through NGC 101? And why do we make them sign a membership covenant and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I first would say, where's tithing in the New Testament? And then second, I would say it's our desire to control you. I
Right.
want to know who I can control. So those are my answers. Ben, what do you got?
Well, for one, you could tithe and attend and still do so anonymously.
Okay.
And this community that we see described in the New Testament of the local church is where people are really known and know others. They're practicing church discipline. They're spurring one another on to love and good deeds. And so just attending, just submitting a tithe check, that's not the kind of Christian life we see described in the New Testament. So that would be for one. again, the formality of it is not necessarily prescribed in the Bible, but more due, I think, to where we're at, like in our culture and society, and even in redemptive history. But regardless of if it's like formal or not, what needs to happen at a local church is this sort of mutual commitment from member to member, leaders to members, members to leaders. So could a church be doing that really well and not have formal church membership? I'd say it'd be really hard, but yeah, they could in theory. But I just think, like I described earlier, the culture we live in, like having the formality of a class and commitment, a signature, those different things, I think it's just really helpful and wise and makes it a lot easier to do in our culture. And that might look different in other cultures around the world. Maybe there's, I'm sure there's many places around the world where there's not a church on every corner, and you're either a part of that body or you're not. They might not need to do it in the same way, but I think in our specifically in the Big Northwest, it's important for us to have that formality.
Yeah, I think two things I would say to them. Number one, especially a church the size of East Vancouver and just attending on Sunday mornings and everything, how are you going to know what you're committing to without the class, right? What do we believe on X, Y, or Z, and how does that play out in our faith family as we encounter A, B, and C, right? And so the class is kind of the way to figure that out. The class is like, okay, here's what this church believes about salvation. Here's how this group of people live out what it looks like to live in community together. And so how can you even know what you're committing to without that? And then the second thing I'd say, and Ben read the first part of this a minute ago, Hebrews 13:17, the obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch of your souls as those who will give an account. But I would say like the formality of it is necessary because of the second part of this verse. It says, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. And I don't even think it matters what size a church is. If there's not that formality, it's nearly impossible for a leadership to know who they're responsible for. And so like, I guess you could just like run a tithe report and an attendance report every month and line those up. But that sounds like something that might cause a little bit of groaning. And so somebody saying like, hey, I'm in and I'm here seems to be a much more effective way of going about that, specifically in the world that we live in, where, like you said, people are transient. Every, the just even average church attendance has dove with the amount of stuff going on in the world and in people's lives. That could be a whole nother episode, but yeah, those are the two reasons I would give to those people that asked that question, Cody.
Yeah. And just super briefly, I'd mention again, individualistic or consumeristic. These are two things we're trying to work against in the American context of Christianity. Individualistic, like this is not an individualistic thing. When we're born into the faith, like we joined a family, and again, big C, church, universal, but that's also manifested on the local level. And so and then consumeristic is the other part of it. And if somebody comes and they give, they're like, hey, well, I tithe, and so I'm not being a consumer. But really, you consume lots of stuff that you like pay for. Right. And so I think like being individualistic and being consumeristic, those are two things we're trying to work against. And church membership flies in the face of both of those and really helps break those things down as we submit to one another and are able to grow where we're planted. So,
yeah. Right on. Well, if this brought up questions or you have something you'd like to add to the conversation, hit us up. podcast@tobethechurch.com is the best place to do that. You can also do it on social media @tobethechurch or in the YouTube comments where you're watching. I actually would suggest watching this episode on YouTube because there's been a few times where the recording has froze a little bit and it makes for some great screenshots. So yeah, do that. Cody, thanks for being on this side of the camera. And since you are on this side of the camera, we just say thanks because the show happens every week because of the work you and your team are putting out in behind the scenes. So hopefully by next Friday, Andrew will be able to get out of his neighborhood and we'll be back in the studio doing our normal podcast. But until then, keep being the church. Have a great week.